Jinnah of Pakistan by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 11, London to Lucknow, 1934 to 1937. Jinnah returned to Bombay in 1934 but did not close his Hampstead establishment or abandon his city chambers. The next few years would be spent sailing back and forth between the two worlds that claimed him, seeking to parcel out his days between those basically incompatible lands and trying to keep himself attuned to both time zones while living mostly in limbo. On March 4, 1934, the Muslim League met in New Delhi and resolved to heal the second major split, which had fragmented the party 1 year earlier, when its acting president, Barrister Mia Abdul Aziz of Peshawar, fired all the secretaries and attempted to transform the League into a party of his own. The Aziz Group, as it came to be called, met in Howrah across the Hooghly from Calcutta in October 1933. It claimed legitimacy, but a month later, the Hidayat Group, named after its president Khan Bahadur Hafiz Hidayat Khan, branded Aziz and his followers rebels. Hidayat Hussain had attended the roundtable conferences where he had regularly met with Jinnah, Shafi and the Agha Khan and had supported the unified Muslim demands. One of the resolutions passed by this group in 1933 authorized the League Council to meet with Jinnah and the Agha Khan to discuss plans for bringing about unity in the ranks of the League. Aziz readily agreed to bring his group back to the League's fold if Jinnah presided over a unified party. Hidayat was at first reluctant to surrender his post as president, but finally agreed to step down for Jinnah, remaining honorary secretary of the League. Jinnah was authorized by the council in March to set the date and place of the 1934 annual session, but he had already booked passage to sail for London on April 23rd, so he could meet with the council only on April 1st or 2nd in New Delhi. Jinnah was given an enthusiastic welcome by 40-odd members of council who attended the proceedings that were closed to the press. After the council meeting ended, Jinnah granted the Associated Press an interview stating, "The League is perfectly sound and healthy, and the conclusion I have come to is that Muslims will not lag behind any other community in serving the very best interests of India." To condemn the white paper, one does not require special arguments. One has only got to read the white paper proposals. That is enough. Sir Samuel Hoare had presented his proposal for Indian constitutional reform, known as the White Paper, to Parliament in March 1933. The Federation of India was to be a union of governors, provinces and Indian states, all of whose power would remain vested in the British Crown. Executive authority over the Federation was to be exercised on behalf of Britain's King Emperor by a Governor-General appointed by His Majesty's pleasure, whose powers included supreme command of the military, naval and air forces in India, and who would personally direct and control the departments of defense, external affairs and ecclesiastical affairs. Such extraordinary powers were unique under any system of government deemed constitutional, and Jinnah was one of their most outspoken critics. A bicameral federal legislature was envisioned consisting of a Council of State with not more than 260 members, 50 of whom would be elected from British India, and an assembly with not more than 375 members, 250 of whom will be elected from British India, with the rest appointed to represent the princely states. There were to be 11 governors' provinces, including Sindh and Orissa, with the appointed governor over each representing the British king. The governor would be empowered to select ministers to assist him in running his province during his pleasure. He would, however, be enjoined to seek to select such executive aid in consultation with the person who, in his judgment, is likely to command the largest following in the legislature, and to appoint those best in a position collectively to command the confidence of the legislature. Such was the nature of provincial autonomy envisioned by the White Paper. There were many elaborate safeguards and emergency powers provided for the governors in the event of a breakdown in the Constitution. Winston Churchill led a vigorous Tory opposition to the White Paper on March 17, 1933, but it passed through Parliament with a comfortable 3-1 margin, indicative of how secure most Englishmen felt with the new Indian reforms. Jinnah's strategy at this point was to turn back toward the Congress to see if its leadership might not, in fact, be prepared to concede all that Macdonald's communal award and had promised to Muslims, thus clearing the way for Hindus and Muslims to join forces in the common front against the White Paper. Angered at the Tory party's rejection of his bid for a parliamentary ticket, disgusted at the high-handed way in which Willingdon and Hoare were running India, Jinnah hoped the time was ripe for communal peace and was ready to launch a new series of talks aimed at weaning Congress from its dependence upon the Hindu Mahasabha position. Can we even at this 11th hour bury the hatchet and forget the past in the presence of imminent danger? Jinnah asked Congress in his statement to the Associated Press. Nothing will give me greater happiness than to bring about complete cooperation and friendship between Hindus and Muslims. And in this desire, my impression is that I have the solid support of Muslims. Muslims are in no way behind any other community in their demand for national self-government. The crux of the whole issue, therefore, is: can we completely assure Muslims that the safeguards to which they attach vital importance will be embodied in the future Constitution of India? Jinnah's willingness to continue to work towards a united national platform terrified the more pro-British leaders of the League like Sir Fazle Hussain and Hidayat Hussain, who joined with the Nawab of Chhatri in trying to muster a Muslim majority against Jinnah as soon as his ship disappeared over the Arabian Sea's horizon. They met to form a parliamentary majlis that was convened by the Nawab of Chhatri, but it did not prove very effective since they failed, despite Hidayat's vigorous exertions, to convene an emergency meeting of the Muslim League's Council to validate the new group's claim to represent most Muslims. Old Hidayat's strenuous labors and frustrations were responsible for his death before the year ended, thus removing the mainspring from that majlis, revolt against Jinnah's leadership. Jinnah's pendulum strategy of swinging the ballast of Muslim support from Congress to the British and then back again, which thus won the greatest concessions for Muslims at every stage of the long, tough struggle toward a negotiated transfer of power, remained his most effective long-range technique. While in London, Jinnah was re-elected that October by the Muslims of Bombay City to represent them in New Delhi's assembly. There was, in fact, no contest since he was only name nominated for the seat he had first taken before World War I, and to which he would return as leader of the Assembly's independent party. He sailed back to Bombay in December 1934 and entrained to New Delhi in January 1935. Jinnah soon thereafter met with Congress President Rajendra Prasad, 1884 to 1963, a Bihari lawyer destined to become India's first president. Their heart-to-heart talks failed to resolve the communal deadlock, Pandit Madan Malaviya, leader of the Hindu Mahasabha, who had also been president of the Congress, still adamantly refused to accept Jinnah's Muslim demands despite their equity. Thus, once again, the fate of the helpless millions was sealed by a few stubborn leaders who refused to stretch that extra inch of representational concession to close the gap dividing India's pluralistic society and keeping it constitutionally fragmented. The Jinnah Prasad talks came to an infructuous end, as Prasad put it, alienating the one Muslim leader capable of reining his impatient, high-spirited community into harness with Congress's bullock team. In February 1935, Jinnah stood on the floor of New Delhi's assembly to introduce an amendment in the debate that had just begun on Indian constitutional reform. His three-part proposal was to accept the communal award segment of the white paper until a substitute is agreed upon by the various communities concerned, to urge the removal of objectionable features from the provincial government section, particularly the establishment of second chambers, the extraordinary and special powers of the governors, provisions relating to police rules, secret service and intelligence departments, which rendered the real control and responsibility of the executive and legislature ineffective, and to reject the All India Federation scheme proposed for the centre as thoroughly rotten, fundamentally bad and totally unacceptable. Bhulabhai Desai, 1877 to 1946, leader of the Assembly's Congress party, spoke against Jinnah's proposal to support the communal award, but Congress did not vote against Part 1. It merely abstained. Jinnah proved himself the most brilliant parliamentarian in British India. My amendment accepts the communal award until a substitute is agreed upon between the communities concerned. Now, it may be that our Hindu friends are not satisfied with the communal award. But at the same time, I can also tell the House that my Muslim friends are not satisfied with it either. And again, speaking as an individual, my self-respect will never be satisfied until we produce our own scheme. But why do I accept it? I accept it because we have done everything that we could have so far to come to a settlement. Therefore, whether I like it or whether I do not like it, I accept it because unless I accept that no scheme of constitution is possible, sir, this is a question of minorities and it is a political issue. Minorities means a combination of things. It may be that a minority has a different religion from the other citizens of the country. Their language may be different, their race may be different, their culture may be different, and the combination of all these various elements, religion, culture, race, language, arts, music, and so forth, makes the minority a special entity in the state. And that separate entity as an entity wants safeguards. Surely, therefore, we must face this question as a political problem. We must solve it and not evade it. Jinnah's argument carried the House by a vote of 68 to 15, with the official bloc and elected Europeans voting with him. As for parts 2 and 3 of his proposal, they were voted upon together, with Congress supporting him and the government opposed, and those amendments carried by an even greater majority. Jinnah realized full well that his was but a paper victory, one that Britain's parliament could ignore with impunity, but he had at least demonstrated both to Britain's Tory party and to the Congress that his tiny minority voice could still be magnified if modulated properly, win enough strategic support to carry India's commons, transforming Muslim minority demands into a majority position. Yet it remained an uphill struggle trying to recapture and retain a position of national leadership in a land where he lived only for a few months of each year. He sought to win back former disciples like Chagla in Bombay, but Chagla would not rejoin the Muslim League, rejecting his old boss's appeals and countering them by urging Jinnah to organize a thoroughly non-communal, strong party to recapture his position as a tribune of the people. On the eve of his 60th birthday, however, Jinnah was hardly prepared to abandon the one party that retained enough faith in him to elect him to lead it. He returned aboard the SS Conte Verde to London again in late April of 1935, continuing to divide his ear between the poles of his establishments. For the next 6 months, Jinnah was preoccupied with his legal work, which had by this time become so lucrative that he reportedly earned 40,000 rupees per month, £2,000, at the bar alone. Before the end of October 1935, he returned to Bombay to help reorganize his Muslim League in preparation for the elections that would bring a fresh cadre of representatives to British India's provincial and central legislatures under the Government of India Act of 1935. That act was passed into law on August 2, 1935, and though its All India Federation section would never be implemented, the other portions of it served for the most part as the constitution for British India after 1937 and remained the skeletal framework for both India and Pakistan for years after each attained independence a decade later. The inimitable Winston Churchill dismissed the act as the rotten fruit of half a decade of tumultuous confabulations that had brought us nothing that has been good for this country or India, making no advance towards efficiency, no advance towards finality, and above all, no advance towards agreement. Jinnah felt about the 1935 Act precisely the way he had about the white paper that sired it. We all know that the new constitution has been forced upon us, he said on returning to India late in 1935. It is now the duty of the various leaders to put their lunch together and chalk out a definite and common policy with regard to the constitution. Jinnah's critique of the All India Federation in New Delhi's assembly in 1935 had been the strongest attack against it expressed in India, for Gandhi, who had announced his retirement from Congress in September 1934, devoted himself to the abolition of untouchability and village reforms as part of his Sarvodaya, uplift of all socialism. I believe that the proposed federation, means nothing but absolute sacrifice of all that British India has stood for and developed during the last 50 years in the matter of progress in the representative form of government. No province was consulted as such. No consent of the princes has been obtained whether they are willing to federate as federating units on the terms which are laid down by the British government. My next objection is that it is not workable. And before retaking his seat in that important debate, Jinnah explained why he proposed accepting the provincial autonomy section of the new constitution. First of all, the franchise, enlargement of the electors and voters, that is the foundation stone of any constitution. Next, all members of the provincial legislatures will be elected, that is an advance. Your cabinet in the provinces will be of the elected members responsible to the legislature, and the legislature will be responsible to the electorates. That framework of the provincial constitution is undoubtedly an advance. Jawaharlal Nehru had been released from prison in September 1935 and permitted to leave India to join his tubercular wife Kamala, then living in Germany. Nehru remained in Europe till Kamala's death on February 28, 1936, but visited England for brief interludes, where he avoided meeting the British officials. However, Lord Lothian, 1882 to 1940, the Liberal Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for India, who had chaired the Reforms Franchise Committee, tried very hard to lure Nehru to his country house, where he and the Earl of Halifax, formerly Lord Irwin, Britain's new foreign minister, hoped unsuccessfully to convince Nehru of the value of their Indian constitution. Then Nehru returned to India to take charge of Congress once again, succeeding Prasad as president in 1936. The Muslim League met in Bombay that April, with Jinnah as permanent president, introducing his old Lucknow pact colleagues, Sir Syed Wazir Hasan, the retired Chief Justice of Lucknow's High Court, to preside over the League's 1936 session. Fazle Hussain should have presided, but the illness resulting in his death later that year forced him to withdraw. Fazle Hassan bitterly disliked Jinnah and wrote in his diary a month earlier, "I will not now go out of my way to be nice to him." Jinnah gave him no opportunity to test that resolve, however, twice postponing the last meeting they had scheduled for Saturday, March 7, 1936, then calling to say he was too busy. Sir Fazle Hassan concluded, "It appears that he was avoiding seeing me." The Bombay session of the League initiated the slow process of transforming that small fragmented party into a mass movement with district branch volunteers throughout the country who could nominate candidates and spread the League's message in every Muslim town and village of South Asia. An initial fund of ₹500,000 was to be raised by the League Council to pay for expanded secretariat needs. But student volunteers were recruited from Aligarh and other universities to carry on the political spade work. Jinnah's idea, voiced by Sir Syed Hasan in his presidential address, was to issue a joint Congress League invitation to all other progressive political parties in the country to find such minimum measure of agreement as would enable us to act together to draft a constitution for India. It was one more try for the original Lucknow Pact approach and the pre-Nehru report, all parties conference concept. He had gone so far as to draft 4 points that would serve, he hoped, to lure Jawaharlal's Congress liberals and possibly even the Mahasabha to a round table, this time on Indian soil. Number 1. A democratic responsible government with adult franchise to take the place of the present system. Number 2. Repeal of all exceptionally repressive laws and the gaining of the right of free speech, freedom of press and organization. Number 3. Immediate economic relief to the peasantry, state provision for educated and uneducated unemployed, and an 8-hour working hour day with fixed minimum wages for the workers. Number 4. Introduction of free compulsory primary education. Jinnah moved the resolution stating his League's emphatic protest against forcing the Constitution as embodied in the Government of India Act of 1935 upon the people of India against their will, and in spite of their repeated disapproval and dissent. In speaking to this resolution, Jinnah advised his followers, indeed all Indians, to treat the new federal scheme the same way as the Germans had reacted to the Treaty of Versailles. He viewed constitutional agitation as the only sound approach for pressuring the British into changing their scheme, since, as he put it, armed revolution was an impossibility, while non-cooperation had been tried and found a failure. To effect such a constitutional transformation, however, required all communities to stand shoulder to shoulder. Supreme strategist of pendulum negotiations that he was, Jinnah probed first at the weak points of one opponent, then rushed to the opposite side's exposed flank, always seeking as he shifted his ground to rally his former enemy to his side. Small wonder both sides mistrusted him. Yet each underrated him, failing to see that he was, in fact, the most ingenious advocate. then of India as a whole and later of its Muslim minority alone, extracting for each client the greatest constitutional concession which the British and Congress were willing to grant at every turn. Just when one side thought it had him securely in its corner, Jinnah twirled with agility totally out of reach. For example, in New Delhi's assembly in March 1936, the Congress party had tabled an adjournment motion for censure against the government for having arrested Subhas Chandra Bose. The British confidently faced that no confidence challenge, assuming they had more than enough independent party votes to put it down. But as Jawaharlal jubilantly wrote in a letter to Subhas, the censure motion was passed by a majority of 3 votes, Jinnah and some of his colleagues remaining bravely neutral. A month later, Lord Linlithgow replaced Lord Wellington as Viceroy, calling out to inaugurate the constitution he had been most instrumental in helping to complete as chairman of the Joint Parliamentary Committee. In his first broadcast to India, Linlithgow tried to assure his pluralistic audience of his personal impartiality, stating, "God has indeed been good to me, for he has given me 5 children. I left them all dearly, but among my children I have no favorite." The Viceroy's son, who reported that speech, also wrote through of Jinnah's reaction to it as ominous, adding, in what must have been Linlithgow's perception of the League's leader's policy, that he told his followers that the new Viceroy's pledge of impartiality was a poor reward for Muslim loyalty to the government. That same month, Jinnah stood before the Muslim League almost 6 years after Iqbal's Allahabad address and a full 3 years after the first Cambridge call for Pakistan, urging his followers to stand shoulder to shoulder with Congress and other Hindu majority parties in the nation. This made it far more difficult, of course, for him to win or maintain the allegiance of Muslim colleagues, especially powerful provincial barons like Sir Fazl-e Hasan in the Punjab and Sir Ghulam Hussain Hidayatullah, 1879 to 1948 of Sindh, Sir Muhammad Sadullah, 1886 to 1950 of Assam, or Abdul Qayyum Khan of the northwest frontier, who thought only in terms of special provincial privileges for Muslims under the shield of a British wing of central power. Jinnah's vision went beyond that, soaring to encompass a future of complete equality among nations, Indian and English or Pakistani, if Congress remained as churlish as some of its leaders persisted in being towards his Muslim demands. To strengthen the League, bolster its bargaining position, and help prepare it for contesting elections, Jinnah was authorized at its Bombay meeting to appoint and preside over a new Central Parliamentary Board and affiliated provincial parliamentary boards. These boards, similar to those earlier established by Congress, were to become Jinnah's organizational arms in extending his power over the entire Muslim community. It was not before late May that he managed to win acceptance from 54 prominent Muslim politicians to serve on his central board, which met for the first time in Lahore from June 8 to 11 in 1936. Sir Fazl-e Hasan died on July 9th, removing Jinnah's foremost rival from the venue of his board's birth. Jinnah was, moreover, careful to court and win the support of Iqbal, with whom he met in Lahore during the last week in May.